Chapter 56 Toward a New Vision, Race, Class, and Gender as Categories of Analysis and Connection by Patricia Hill Collins. This is considered a classic because Collins is one of the first scholars to argue the necessity of an intersectional framework to better address systems of social inequality. Collins's work is both academic and activist in orientation. Collins frames his reading around two questions. 1. How can we reconceptualize race, social class, and gender as categories of analysis? And 2. How can we transcend the barriers created by our own expressions with race, social class, and gender oppression in order to build the types of coalitions essential for social change? Collins argues first for the need for new theories of race, social class, and gender, and second for making connections among our personal lives, our scholarship, our teaching, and our relationships with our colleagues and students. Collins argues that dichotomous social categories are problematic, as are additive analyses of oppression, in which, for instance, scholars studying gender decided to add race ethnicity into their analysis instead of addressing both variables simultaneously. Instead, Collins maintains that we need to understand how oppression operates at various levels in society, the individual, the institutional, and the symbolic levels, in what she calls the matrix of oppression. Once we understand what we are studying, we can turn our attention to social change. While many of us have little difficulty assessing our own victimization within some major systems of oppression, whether it be by race, social class, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, age, or gender, we typically fail to see how our thoughts and actions uphold someone else's subordination. In essence, each group identifies the type of oppression with which it feels most comfortable and being fundamental, and classifies all other types as being lesser importance. Once we realize that there are few pure victims or oppressors, and that each one of us derives varying amounts of penalty and privilege from the multiple systems of oppression that frame our lives, then we'll be in a position to see the need for new ways of thought and action. To get at that piece of the oppressor which is planted deep within each of us, we also need to change our daily behavior. Currently, we are all enmeshed in a complex web of problematic relationships that grant our mirror image full human subjectivity while stereotyping and objectifying those most different from ourselves. These judgments by category must be replaced with full human relationships that transcend the legitimate differences created by race, class, and gender as categories of analysis. We require new categories of connection, new visions of what our relationships with one another can be. Our task is immense. We must first recognize race, class, and gender as interlocking categories of analysis, and that together cultivate profound differences in our personal biographies. But then we must transcend those very differences by reconceptualizing race, class, and gender in order to create new categories of connection. Collins asserts that we must shift our discourse away from additive analysis of oppression. Such approaches are typically based on two key premises. First, they depend on either-or dichotomous thinking. Persons, things, and ideas are conceptualized in terms of their opposites, in spite of the fact that we all have both-and identities. Everyone in a room has a race, gender, class-specific identity. Either-or dichotomous thinking is especially troublesome when applied to theories of oppression, because every individual must be classified as being either oppressed or not oppressed. But both-and position of simultaneously being oppressed and oppressor becomes conceptually impossible. A second premise of additive analysis of oppression is that these dichotomous differences must be ranked. One side of the dichotomy is typically labeled dominant, and the other subordinate. Applying this premise to discussions of oppression can lead to the assumption that oppression can be quantified, and that some groups are oppressed more than others. Additive analysis of oppression rests squarely on the twin pillars of either-or thinking and the necessity to quantify and rank all relationships in order to know where one stands. In essence, if you add together separate oppressions, you are left with a grand oppression greater than the sum of its parts. This recognition that one category may have salience over another for a given time and place does not minimize the theoretical importance of assuming that race, class, and gender as categories of analysis structure all relationships. How are relationships of domination and subordination structured and maintained in the American political economy? How do race, class, and gender function as parallel and interlocking systems that shape the basic relationship of domination and subordination? Collins says it's based upon institutional, symbolic, individual dimensions of oppression. Sarah Harding's contention that gender oppression is structured along three main dimensions, the institutional, the symbolic, and the individual, offers a useful model for a more comprehensive analysis encompassing race, class, and gender oppression. Systemic relationships of domination and subordination, structured through social institutions such as schools, businesses, hospitals, the workplace, and government agencies, represent the institutional dimensions of oppression. Widespread societal sanctioned ideologies are used to justify relations of domination and subordination and comprise the symbolic dimension of oppression. Central to this process is the use of stereotypical or controlling images of diverse race, class, and gender groups. It is important to see how the symbolic images applied to different race, class, and gender groups interact in maintaining systems of domination and subordination. Race, class, and gender pervade a wide range of what appears to be universal language. For example, viewing images of masculinity and femininity as the universal gender symbolism, rather than as symbolic images that are race, class, and gender specific, renders the experience of people of color and non-privileged white women and men invisible. One way to dehumanize an individual or a group is to deny the reality of their experiences. So when we refuse to deal with race or class because they do not appear to be directly relevant to gender, we are actually becoming part of someone else's problem. On the individual dimension of oppression, our individual biographies vary tremendously. As a result of our institutional and symbolic statuses, all of our choices become political acts. Each of us must come to terms with the multiple ways in which race, class, and gender, as categories of analysis, frame our individual biographies. Imagine how different your life might be if you had been born black or white or poor or of a different race, class, gender group than the one in which you are most familiar. The institutional treatment you would have received and the symbolic meanings attached to your very existence might differ dramatically from what you now consider to be natural, normal, and a part of everyday life. You might be the same, but your personal biography might have been quite different. Collins wants us to really process this question. How can we transcend the barriers created with race, class, and gender oppression in order to build the types of coalitions essential for social change? First, we must think about differences in power and privilege. We must recognize that our differing experiences with oppression create problems in the relationships among us. Each of us lives with a system that vests us with varying levels of power and privilege. These differences in power, whether structured along axes of race, class, gender, age, or sexual orientation, frame our relationships. Differences in power constrain our ability to connect with one another, even when we think we are engaged in dialogue across differences. Coming from a tradition where most relationships across difference are squarely rooted in relations of domination and subordination, we have much less experience relating to people as different but equal. The classroom is potentially one powerful and safe place where dialogues among individuals of unequal power relationships can occur. The classroom may be able to minimize differences so that people of different levels of power can use race, class, and gender as categories of analysis in order to generate meaningful dialogues. For Collins, social transformations, whether the college curricula or of the communities in which we live and work, require moving outside our areas of specialization and groups of interest in order to build coalitions across differences. Social change can also occur when coalitions around common causes are built. A second issue of building relationships and coalitions essential for social change concerns knowing the real reasons for coalition. Just what brings people together? One powerful catalyst fostering group solidarity is the presence of a common enemy. Sharing a common cause assists individuals and groups in maintaining relationships that transcend their differences. Building effective coalitions involves struggling to hear one another and developing empathy for each other's points of view. The coalitions that Collins has been involved in that lasted and that worked have been those where commitment to a specific issue mandated collaboration as the best strategy for addressing the issue at hand. A third issue involved in building the types of relationships and coalitions essential for social change concerns the issue of individual accountability. But while we may not have been created the problem, we're each responsible for making individual personal choices concerning which elements, race, class, and gender oppression we will accept and which we will work to change. One essential component of this accountability involves developing empathy for the experiences of individuals and groups different than ourselves. Empathy begins with taking an interest of the facts of other people's lives, both as individuals and as groups. If you care about a person, you should want to know not only the details of their personal biography, but a sense of how race, class, and gender as categories of analysis created the institutional and symbolic backdrop for their personal biography. How can you hope to assess a person's character without knowing the details of the circumstances they face? We as individuals take those same categories of analysis that have created cleavages in our lives, in this case categories of race, gender, and class, and use them as categories of connection and building empathy for each other's experiences. Finding common causes and building empathy is difficult, no matter which side of privilege we inhabit. Building empathy from the dominant side of privilege is difficult simply because individuals from privileged backgrounds are not encouraged to do so. Since there is no compelling reason to examine the source of meaning of one's own privilege, those who do so have freely chosen this stance. They are making conscious effort to root out the piece of the oppressor planted within them. For Collins, they are entitled to the support of people of color in their efforts. Men who declare themselves feminists, members of the middle class who ally themselves with anti-poverty struggles, heterosexuals who support gays and lesbians are all trying to grow, and their efforts place them far ahead of the majority who never think of engaging in such important struggles. Building empathy from the subordinate side of privilege is also difficult, but for different reasons. Members of subordinate groups are understandably reluctant to abandon a basic mistrust of members of powerful groups because this basic mistrust has traditionally been central to their survival. Like the privileged, members of subordinate groups must also work towards replacing judgments by category with new ways of thinking and acting. Refusing to do so stifles prospects for effective coalition and social change.